Salutations, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm continuing my Irish oppression myth series. I was looking at the 1798 rebellion when some idealistic revolutionaries tried to introduce a democratic republic into Ireland by force. They wanted to copy the French model, but in France things were all ending in tears. As I said, they can at best be accused of naivete, because if their French friends had succeeded, we certainly would not have been independent, and France was not very democratic at the time, having their rigged referenda and so on, and pretty soon was not to be a republic. Napoleon was going to be the dictator there. Had Napoleon chosen to take ship for Ireland rather than Egypt, perhaps things would have ended very differently. And now, about Theobald Wolfe Tone, I've never heard it said that he was mistreated in custody in any way. He had a fair trial. He was allowed to speak in his own defence, which is why he gave a very defiant oration in the dock. And likewise, Robert Emmet, whose rising ended up as a street brawl where Lord Kilwarden and his nephew were hacked to death. Emmet was not mistreated in custody in any way. I've never heard anyone allege that. In fact, most of the prisoners were treated honourably. Now, he had a fair trial. He was allowed to speak in his own defence, and that's why he gave this very truculent speech. He was put to death in a particularly horrific way, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The last person to suffer that in Ireland. These were brutal times in many parts of the world. What was the punishment for treason in other countries? It was death everywhere. Often a gruesome death like that. Anyway, that sort of ritual killing of someone is revolting. I agree, that's what you're probably thinking. I don't like capital punishment full stop, but if we're to have it at all, could it not be an instantaneous death? Don't drag it out. Alright, so it seems to be an axiom for many people, particularly those on the liberal left, that Irish history was a tragedy. Jesse Jackson said that on a trip to Ireland about 10 years ago, or Senator Edward Kennedy used to say it. He wrote it in a foreword to a book. So our tragedies are mostly Anglophobia and sectarianism. Now, to a large extent, this is the doing of Republicans, and to some extent to Loyalists too. And yes, of course, there are bad English people. There are English serial killers, for goodness sake, which is not to say that most English people are bad. But I really don't think we do have a tragic history. No country's history is entirely gleeful, but we missed out on the horrors of the Second World War, of course, and you might say, well, that's down to being an independent country by then. There's some truth in that. But anyway, look at countries like, say, France, which had its wars of religion in the 16th century, obviously had the Second World War and conflicts since, and, was ruled by royal despots till 1789, or look at Germany, what they went through in the Second World War, and East Germany being a dictatorship. People were shot dead simply for trying to exercise their right to go from one part of Germany to another. And, they had all these despotic regimes well into the 19th century. I could go on. This is European countries alone. Italy, obviously, which had a fascist government in the early 40s, and they had lots of despotic governments up until about 1861. And they had loads of internal fighting in the centuries leading up to that. Or Spain with its civil war, with its fascist authoritarian governments in 1975. Centuries ago, they had this absolute monarchy, and they're under stranglehold of the whole of the church. Well, let me see. Look at Romania with this demented cult of the personality around Ceausescu for decades, and the early part of the communist government when their dictator, Gheorghe Gheorghiu, said that the Black Sea Canal would be the graveyard of the middle class, and sending tens of thousands of people to work to death. I could go on and on. There are just so many countries that had it far worse than we did. Yes, we had a famine in the 1840s. In the old days, every country had famines. So we forget that the idea that everyone gets enough to eat is actually quite a modern one. I mean, it's wonderful. I would like it would have always been the case. But that was not abnormal, people suffering malnutrition in bygone centuries. So I could list all the countries in the world, and really our history is not as horrific as that of most countries, but not by a long shot. And anywhere outside Europe, but even worse really until very recently. So all these lands have endured misery, either malevolent dictatorships, wars on an enormous scale, mass disease and low life expectancy, severe penury, genocide, slavery, and all the rest of it. Yeah, and by the way, the English abolished slavery in Ireland. Now, I know when Cromwell was fighting against people, royalists, some of those who were captured were sent to the West Indies as slaves, all right, as being a prisoner of war. But in the normal course of events, people were not enslaved. So it is yet another outright lie by Republicans to claim that we were in slavery. Even as a metaphor, they shouldn't say that. And Pierce was saying that, you know, there are many things more horrible than death, and one of them is slavery. It was grossly demeaning to those who really did suffer slavery. And remember, slavery was legal in some countries well into the 20th century. In Saudi Arabia until 1962, in Mauritania until 1982. And even today, there's people trafficking going on. So this is not a word to be taken lightly. Anyway, so Irish nationalists of today are very eager to submerge our nationality into the European Union. And they speak about the EU as though it's morally superior. Now, there's much to be said for the EU, but it's just another sort of nationalism. The EU isn't evil. This is a whole other conversation. One could be an ardent Europhile and not have to agree with Irish nationalism, or indeed agree with it. But isn't it ironic, being semi-hostile to our neighbour, Great Britain, with which we have so much in common, with whom we are so intermingled, the UK is our partner in the EU, well, for the moment, but so desperate to be separated from our brothers in Great Britain, yet to unite with people from Latvia and Bulgaria and so on, with which we have very little in common, which we have got no historic links. What are the striking similarities between Ireland and Bulgaria, for instance? Not anti-Bulgarian, but they're just fairly far away, quite distinct, and really we had relatively little in common with them. So people often say that in Ireland we did not connect with Great Britain willingly, but that is not the case. You could look at the Treaty of Windsor, when our political leaders agreed that Henry II was the Lord of Ireland, the Synod of Cashel, when our ecclesiastical leaders agreed to the same. So Pope Adrian IV wrote Laudabilita, that's a papal bull, authorising Henry II to bring Catholicism to Ireland. Because, of course, we had our own Irish church saying Mass in Irish, celebrating Easter at a different date, even a different tonsure, that's hairstyle for the monks. Now, having a separate Irish church, there's nothing bad with that, but if one believes in Catholicism, therefore one should welcome a king who is bringing Catholicism. So can a Catholic in good conscience oppose the connection that brought us Catholicism? And incidentally, St. Patrick was not sent by the Pope. That is a later medieval invention. In the Middle Ages, there was a tradition that popes had jurisdiction over islands, could grant islands. Like they did this with Sicily, they did this with England. I know England's only half of that island. So our Gaelic chieftains, they acknowledged the English king as Lord of Ireland. And I talked about the Tudor policy of surrender and regrant. Now, yes, some force was used. Ireland was created by war. Countries are created by war. It's very difficult to think of a country that wasn't created by war. The borders are expanded or maintained or shrunk through fighting, which is not to say that we want fighting in the future. So we shouldn't pretend that Ireland prior to Strongbow arriving was all sweetness and light. Ireland wasn't really united. We had several kingdoms. I know we had a high king at Tara, but we didn't have a regal dynasty. It's true that sometimes a family would manage to hold the high kingship for several generations. But there would be periodic civil wars as we try to sort out who the new king would be. Now, there's something to be said for elected kings, as in the royal family electing a king from amongst themselves, because ideally someone with leadership qualities would come to the fore, rather than primogeniture, which meant that the eldest son inherited the crown, even if he was a weakling or an imbecile. So we didn't have simpletons as kings, but there was continuous warfare. Ireland was only properly united under the Stuarts only through our connection with England. Talk about counties. The shiring of Ireland was completed in 1610. And counties are so important to our identity. So we use them for Gaelic games, for example. Don't say this at Croke Park, but we owe the county system to our English friends and cousins. So the GAA would not like to be reminded that our county boundaries are an invention of the Crown. So let's think of all the Irishmen who rose to high office in Great Britain. Winston Churchill was of Irish descent, so I don't think I can say it's an Irishman, it's about 1/8 Irish. The Marquess of Lansdowne in the 18th century, even before the Act of Union, he was Prime Minister of Great Britain. George Canning, Irish through and through. The Duke of Wellington, his surname would be Colley, really, not Wellesley, related to George Colley, that Fine Gael politician of the 60s. Andrew Bonar Law, half Irish. Tony Blair was half Irish. John Major's a quarter Irish. I think when it's less than a quarter, one has to say of Irish descent. I go by the passport rule. If one has one grandparent born in Ireland, including Northern Ireland, one can be called Irish. British royal family is descended from Brian Boru. I look at Princess Sophie, she's half Irish. And so many distinguished British soldiers have been Irish, like Lord Alan Brooke, Lord Gort, Richard O'Connor, Sir John French, Viscount Ypres as it became, Sir Henry Wilson, the Earl of Cavan, Lord Montgomery of Alamein, Lord Kitchen of Khartoum, was born in Kerry. What else was I going to point out? Yeah, I can't remember who wrote it. I think it was Terence O'Neill said that Ulster went into the mass production of field marshals when it was 3. But for a place with a fairly small population, it's quite a lot. And look at writers in England who were exalted, such as C.S. Lewis and Oscar Wilde. Both lionised over there, they were Irish. George Bernard Shaw, likewise, despite being an outspoken Anglophone. So Great Britain was extraordinarily forgiving to Brendan Behan, despite having tried to blow up civilians. Such magnanimity extended to militants is almost unknown, not extended to loyalists. So Irish actors and musicians have always been very popular, from Richard Harris to Sinead O'Connor, despite O'Connor, and Harris being proponents of IRA terrorism. And then there's U2, an honourably anti-IRA band. I remember in the 90s when London was being blown up by the IRA, what was the hottest show in town? Riverdance.